but a tragic fallout, a bitter wrangling over causes, blame, guilt, and remedies. And most of us would agree that almost every cause mentioned had a role. Historic and recent failings of government and private behavior, various social and economic inequities. These causes have all been examined and are pretty well understood today. But there is one other important cause of civil commotion in America that few people know very much about. Simply stated, it is this. No matter how bad the conditions are, trouble does not happen automatically. It must be agitated. That means the riots of the 60s came about because there were those who wanted them to come about, who did everything in their power to cause them. It is these agitators and their methods we'll be examining during the next half hour. Many of the film sequences you'll see were shot by TV news cameramen, local police departments, and the Army Signal Corps during actual riots. So many of them are not in beautiful living color or have the kind of quality you're used to seeing in your neighborhood theater. But these scenes are real as the point we'll try to make in this film, that to cope with civil disorders, we must understand and act on all the causes, including the people who manipulate violence and destruction, the people we call the Riot Makers. A chemist knows that if he drops a block of sodium in water, it will explode. An engineer knows that if he buries dynamite in proper quantities and patterns and detonates it, he can dig an irrigation ditch. And a trained revolutionary knows that if he chooses proper slogans, gathers a crowd, and sends agents in to agitate it, he can create a riot. The techniques of riot making are as simple, scientific, and systematic as that. Of course, street crowds and mobs and mass hysteria have been weapons of political warfare from time immemorial. In ancient Rome, the riot touched off by Mark Antony with his funeral oration for Caesar helped him overthrow the government, and ever since, the manipulated mass demonstration has been an effective weapon for opportunists who would achieve their own ends by force. In 1789, the people of France, under the leadership of the Duke of Orleans, defied the king and took to the streets and stormed the Bastille. This was the start of the French Revolution and sparked hundreds of riots throughout the country. There are many other examples of mob action in the history of countries around the world. But until the 20th century, riots and civil upheavals were usually spontaneous. True, professional troublemakers and agitators usually figured in the plot somewhere, but no one ever had begun to analyze their role in a scientific spirit, to collect the techniques of agitation, create a handbook, and train others in the art of disruption and revolution, until this man, Vladimir Lenin, the evil genius who became the chief architect, instigator, and beneficiary of the Russian Revolution. Lenin studied carefully every account of urban insurrection and other writings on the use of propaganda, mass manipulation. A major part of his early credo was that mass movements can and must be artificially promoted. His methods consisted of exploiting every trace of discontent, creating widespread illusions about the nature and strength of the movement, and then seizing power. By 1915, Lenin had so cultivated his techniques that he was able to estimate quite precisely how much organization and agitation was required to achieve a given result. In 1917, Lenin and his trained Bolshevik followers used their accumulated knowledge to harness virtually every Russian who had a gripe, and promising them true democracy and reform, rode them all to power. Lenin's methodology has been the guide ever since for those who have tried to overthrow the existing order. One who learned well was Adolf Hitler, who openly copied the German Marxist organization and the Leninist Combat Party in constructing his own movement. In Mein Kampf, he wrote, "The technical methods were clear to me. I understood the infamous spiritual terror which this movement exerts on the mass of people, who are neither mentally nor morally equal to such attacks. At any given sign," he wrote, "the leadership unleashes a veritable barrage of lies and slanders against whatever adversary seems most dangerous, until the nerves of the attacked persons break down, and just to have peace again, they give in. However," Hitler concludes, "the fools obtained no peace. The game begins again, and is repeated over and over again until fear of the mad dog results in suggestive paralysis. If the technique sounds familiar, it should, because many of today's agitators have been studying the same technology, the technology of social demolition. Down with the system, down with the government, down with the flag. Rennie Davis, one of the Chicago Seven, speaks.
We understand that there's going to be a gigantic styrofoam ball that spells out USA, and people are going to parade past like sheep and pluck their American flag in this styrofoam ball. Well, we brought an American flag attached to a lollipop because we think that this kind of ritualistic ceremony of flag waving, this kind of mindless patriotism, represents the sort of suckers that Richard Nixon is trying to make out of the American people.
Today's Riot Maker is the end product of 175 years of cultural and technical evolution in mass manipulation. We have dubbed him the Leninoid. He uses the techniques of Lenin without necessarily subscribing to the ideology of Lenin. He's a new type of professional man, the graduate engineer in social demolition, practicing his art in an age of organized revolution. By the hundreds, these Leninoids are crisscrossing America, colonizing in every major city, attacking the very fabric of our constitutional democracy, and spreading an epidemic of false hopes among the nation's youths. Just exactly who are these riot makers of today, these Leninoids? Where did they come from? One of them, Abbie Hoffman, a former psychologist, left his profession for civil rights activism in the South in the early 60s. Hoffman was convicted of crossing state lines to organize the violence at the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, along with Rennie Davis, whose father served as economic advisor to President Truman. A political science graduate, Davis left his graduate studies for SDS activism and gained fame for his theories of organized militant political action. Working with Davis to found the SDS was Thomas Hayden, a former campus newspaper editor who understudied Communist Party leaders in California in 1960. Described as the prototype new leftist, Hayden was also convicted in the Chicago 7 trial. A key leader at Kent State in the radical preconditioning that led up to the riots in which 4 students were killed was Howard Emmer. The son of old-line Communist Party members, Emmer was trained from his earliest days in Leninist sloganeering and mass manipulation techniques. Said one observer, in revolutionary tactics, Emmer was a master. He was fantastic in face-to-face persuasion. Another radical spawned by the civil rights militancy in the South is Rap Brown, a Louisiana native. When he succeeded Stokely Carmichael as head of SNCC, Carmichael said, "You'll be happy to have me back when you hear him." Brown, indicted for inciting to riot in Maryland, interstate transportation of firearms in Louisiana, and listed on the FBI's most wanted list, coined the slogan, "Violence is as American as cherry pie." By no means are all these people members of the world communist conspiracy, so-called. It's not that simple anymore, if indeed it ever was. Some are compulsive revolutionaries, seeking an outlet for their frustrations and complexes. Others are modern-day nihilists. Just as Hitler wanted to see Paris burned, they want to send our world up in flames. There are the philosophers and the amateurs, and those who use the tools of protest for purely personal gain. And some are merely opportunists, who see a way to get themselves in the spotlight and on the television screen, seeking to escape the boredom of ordinary careers, to make what Abbie Hoffman called revolution for the hell of it. These modern Leninoids have inherited from their 19th and 20th century forerunners their whole technology. Their riot-making methods follow a time-tested formula, and the results are as predictable as what happens when the chemist we mentioned earlier drops a block of sodium in water and creates an explosion. There are 3 stages in riot-making. First, the putting together of an organization and the deploying of workers where they can be the most effective. Second, getting the masses of people ready and in the right frame of mind to riot. And third, the riot itself. In the beginning, the professional radicals deploy protest groups into every pyramid of society. Priority targets are organizations which give them access to the mass media, which become outlets for their propaganda. And to recruit new followers, they move into areas where they are most likely to find large groups of discontented people. The biggest such group was the one created by the mechanization of farming after World War II. This so-called tractor revolution created widespread unemployment in rural areas. Relentlessly, the new machines pushed the workers out, and the mass migration to the cities began. By the tens of thousands, and then by the millions they came, lured by the promise of jobs. But they found that here, too, technology had advanced far beyond the training and comprehension of most of the poorly educated farm workers. All told, America's farm revolution crammed an estimated 10 million impoverished people, white and black, into the cities during the 1950s. And right behind them came the radical organizers to exploit the misery and frustrations of the ghetto dwellers. The radicals made no secret of their intentions, boasted SDS Secretary Gregory Calvert just before the 1967 riot in Newark. We are working to build a guerrilla force in an urban environment. We are actively organizing sedition. They got what they wanted. Years later, Newark still shows the scars of 4 days of violence and destruction. One man who studied the early buildup in Newark was Eugene Methvin, author of the book, The Riot Makers.
Propaganda. The SDS moved in there in 1964, led by Tom Hayden. He had a small group with him, and they began knocking on doors, organizing block by block. They took what they called housing surveys, which was really a grievance census, an effort to locate the key slogans and irritants that people would be stirred up about. In 1965, when the Johnson administration started pouring money into the war on poverty, this offered a great target of opportunity to the radicals there in Newark. They took over, literally captured by electoral process, by voting their members onto the boards of directors, 2 of the neighborhood offices set up to conduct the war on poverty. That gave them the physical resources and assets and offices right there in the neighborhoods. This was the power base from which they operated.
What happened in Newark was repeated in large cities all over the country. The social and economic dislocations caused by the mass movement from the farms had made our cities seedbeds for violence. Less easy to understand was what was happening on America's campuses during this same period.
You burned the purchase papers up there. What about it? There was nobody in the building. What about the book?
It went under many names. At Berkeley, it was known as the Free Speech Movement. On other campuses, it had other labels. But whatever it was called, the purposes were the same, to destroy in the name of improving. And behind the demonstrations were the skilled organizers of the New Left, carefully staying in the background to give the movement a look of leaderlessness, of spontaneous action. But their methods and objectives were clear, as was evident in a speech by a leader of the 1968 Columbia University riots. The ability to manipulate people through violence and mass media has never been greater, he said. The potential for liberation for us as radicals has never been more exciting than now. Or these sentences from a handbook written by former SDS Vice President Carl Davidson. Ultimately, we have only one source of power, and that lies in our potential ability to stop the university from functioning, to render the system dysfunctional. Nick Laniello, editor of the University of Wisconsin's independent student newspaper, tells how the radicals operate.
I think the first thing they try to do is monopolize student expression, first by taking over the student newspaper, perhaps, and then taking over the student government, and in large part by being as loud-mouthed as possible. Then they would take up certain issues that would interest students, and oftentimes raising many more. If they couldn't get students to support some of them, or all of them, they could support at least some of them.